Hey, welcome to Late Night Psychology. Get comfortable, adjust your pillow, pull up the blanket if you need one. There's no rush here, nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do except relax and let your mind drift. Tonight, we're going to explore something together, something that psychiatrists and researchers have been trying to understand for a very long time. We're going to talk about how certain minds work, not in a scary way, not in a sensational way, just calmly, curiously, the way you might wonder about something late at night when the world is quiet and your thoughts can wander. Why do some people become predators? It's a question that doesn't have easy answers. But over the decades, psychology has developed some frameworks, some ways of understanding, some patterns that show up again and again when researchers study these cases. Tonight, we're looking at 3 of those patterns. The first is psychopathy. You've probably heard that word before, but what does it actually mean? What's really going on in a psychopathic mind? How do they see the world? How do they see other people? The second is compartmentalization. This is the ability some people have to keep different parts of their lives completely separate, to be one person in one context and someone entirely different in another, to hide things even from themselves. The third is how violent fantasies develop. Where do they come from? Why do some people act on them while others don't? What does that progression look like over years, over decades? We'll explore each of these through real cases, real people who have been studied extensively. Not to sensationalize what they did, but to understand the psychology behind it. So settle in, let your breathing slow down, and let's begin. In 1941, a psychiatrist named Hervey Cleckley published a book. He called it The Mask of Sanity. It's a strange title, isn't it? The Mask of Sanity, as if sanity itself could be a disguise, something worn rather than something real. But that's exactly what Cleckley was describing. He had spent years working in psychiatric hospitals, and during those years, he had noticed something that troubled him. Something he couldn't quite explain at first. Among his patients were people who seemed fine, more than fine, actually. They were intelligent, charming, good conversationalists, the kind of people you'd enjoy meeting at a dinner party, the kind of people who made a good first impression. But there was something wrong with them. Cleckley couldn't put his finger on it at first. On the surface, everything seemed normal. But the longer he worked with these patients, the more he realized that something fundamental was missing. They lied, constantly, even when there was no reason to lie. They made promises they never intended to keep. They hurt people, emotionally, financially, sometimes physically. And they didn't seem to feel bad about it. Oh, they could say they felt bad. They could apologize. They could look you in the eye and say, "I'm sorry," with what seemed like genuine remorse. But it wasn't real. Cleckley eventually realized that these patients were performing. They had learned over the years what emotions they were supposed to show in certain situations, and they could produce those emotions on demand. But they didn't actually feel them. Inside, where most of us have feelings, they had something else, or maybe nothing at all. Cleckley called this the mask of sanity, a perfect imitation of a normal human being worn by someone who was fundamentally different underneath. This was the first systematic description of what we now call psychopathy. Let's slow down here for a moment. Psychopathy, it's a word that gets thrown around a lot. In movies, in TV shows, in casual conversation. Someone cuts you off in traffic and you might think, what a psychopath. But clinically, it means something very specific, and understanding what it actually means is important because it helps explain how certain people can do terrible things while appearing completely normal. So let's take our time with this. In the 1970s, a Canadian psychologist named Robert Hare developed a way to measure psychopathy. He called it the PCLR, the Psychopathy Checklist, revised. It's a clinical tool, a way for trained professionals to assess whether someone has psychopathic traits. It looks at 20 different characteristics and scores each one on a scale of 0 to 2. The maximum score is 40. Most people score around 4 or 5. The average person has a few of these traits to some degree. That's normal. But some people score much higher, 30, 35, sometimes even higher. Those are the psychopaths. Now here's what's interesting. Hare noticed that the 20 traits fell into 2 broad categories. He called them Factor 1 and Factor 2. Factor 1 traits are the emotional and interpersonal characteristics. The stuff that's going on inside. Things like superficial charm, the ability to make a great first impression, to seem likable and engaging, grandiose sense of self-worth, believing you're special, smarter than everyone else, destined for great things, pathological lying, lying constantly even when the truth would serve you better, manipulation, using people for your own benefit without caring about how it affects them, lack of remorse, not feeling guilty when you hurt someone, shallow emotions, having feelings that are thin, fleeting, not connected to anything deep, callousness, not caring about other people's suffering. These are the Factor 1 traits, the emotional deficits, the missing pieces. Factor 2 traits are different. They're more about lifestyle and behavior, things like impulsivity, acting without thinking, irresponsibility, not meeting your obligations, need for stimulation, getting bored easily, always needing excitement, poor behavioral controls, losing your temper, acting out, early behavioral problems, getting in trouble as a kid. These Factor 2 traits are more visible, more obvious. They're the things that get people arrested, fired, kicked out of school. But here's the key insight that Hare discovered. Most criminals score high on Factor 2. They're impulsive, irresponsible. They make bad decisions and get caught. But the truly dangerous psychopaths, the ones who can evade detection for years, they score high on Factor 1. They have the emotional deficits, the charm, the mask, and that mask protects them. Let's think about this for a moment. Imagine someone who feels no genuine remorse. Not feels remorse, but ignores it. Not feels remorse, but acts anyway. Just doesn't feel it at all. For most of us, guilt is automatic. If we hurt someone, we feel bad. We can't help it. The feeling just arises, whether we want it to or not. But what if that mechanism was missing? What if you could hurt someone and feel nothing? No guilt, no shame, no discomfort. Now imagine that same person is intelligent, observant, good at reading social situations. They've noticed over the years that other people seem to feel something called guilt. They've seen how people act when they feel guilty, the body language, the facial expressions, the words they use, and they've learned to imitate it, not because they feel it, but because they've figured out that showing guilt makes social situations go more smoothly. This is what Cleckley meant by the mask. It's not that psychopaths are constantly pretending, it's more subtle than that. The mask becomes integrated into who they are. The charm is real. It's just not connected to anything deeper. They're not faking being charming. They genuinely are charming, but the charm is a tool, not an expression of warmth or connection. This is why psychopaths can be so hard to identify. The mask isn't something they put on and take off. It's woven into their personality. It's how they've learned to navigate the world. And it works. It works very, very well. Now let's talk about what's happening in the brain. Because psychopathy isn't just a collection of behaviors, it's rooted in neurology, in the physical structure and function of the brain itself. Researchers have used brain imaging, fMRI scans, PET scans, to study the brains of psychopaths. And they've found consistent differences. One key area is the amygdala. The amygdala is a small structure about the size and shape of an almond, located deep in the brain. It plays a crucial role in processing emotions, especially fear. When you see something frightening, your amygdala activates. When you see someone else in pain or distress, your amygdala responds. It's part of how we connect emotionally to the world around us. In psychopaths, the amygdala shows reduced activity. When they're shown images of people in distress, their amygdala doesn't light up the way it does in most people. The emotional response is muted, dampened, sometimes almost absent. Think about what this means. When you see fear in someone's face, you feel something. It's automatic. You don't choose to feel it. It just happens. Your amygdala fires and you experience an echo of what they're feeling. This is the basis of empathy. It's how we connect to other people's emotional states. For psychopaths, this response is weak or missing. They can look at fear and feel nothing, or at most, a kind of distant intellectual recognition. That person appears to be afraid, but not the visceral, emotional response that most of us have. This isn't a choice. They're not suppressing their empathy. The empathy just isn't there. Not in the same way. So are psychopaths born or made? This is a question researchers have wrestled with for decades. The answer, as best we can tell, is both. Twin studies that compare identical twins to fraternal twins, suggest that psychopathic traits are significantly heritable, maybe 50 to 60% genetic. If one identical twin shows psychopathic traits, the other twin is much more likely to show them too, even if they were raised in different families. This tells us that genetics plays a major role. But genetics isn't everything. Environment matters too, especially early environment, the first few years of life. Children who show what researchers call callous unemotional traits, early signs of potential psychopathy, don't all become psychopathic adults. Some of them, with the right parenting, the right environment, the right interventions, learn to compensate for their emotional deficits. They develop strategies for functioning prosocially, even if they don't feel emotions the same way others do. But children with these traits who experience abuse, neglect, chaos, violence, they're much more likely to develop the full syndrome. It's like, imagine someone is born with a predisposition, a brain that's wired a little differently. That's the genetic part. First, whether that predisposition develops into full psychopathy depends on what happens next, what kind of childhood they have, what they learn, what they experience. Nature provides the potential, environment shapes how that potential manifests. One researcher put it this way: genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. Now, let's talk about Ted Bundy. Bundy is probably the most studied serial killer in history. His case has been analyzed by psychiatrists, psychologists, criminologists, FBI profilers, journalists, academics. More has been written about Ted Bundy than about almost any other criminal. Why? Because he shattered the popular image of what a serial killer looks like. Before Bundy, people imagined serial killers as obviously disturbed, loners, outcasts, people who couldn't function in normal society, people you could identify at a glance. Bundy wasn't like that. He was handsome, articulate, educated. He'd been a law student, a psychology student. He worked at a suicide crisis hotline, and his co-workers thought he was genuinely compassionate. He had girlfriends, friends, colleagues who respected him. He worked on political campaigns. He was considered a rising star. And he was killing women the entire time. This is what made Bundy so significant for criminal psychology. He demonstrated that the mask of sanity could be essentially perfect, that someone could appear not just normal but exceptional while hiding something monstrous underneath. Let's look at the evidence for Bundy's psychopathy. Because it's textbook, almost perfectly so. Superficial charm. Everyone who met Bundy described him as charming, engaging, easy to talk to. He made people feel comfortable. He made them trust him. Anne Rule, who wrote a book about Bundy, had worked alongside him at the suicide crisis hotline. She genuinely liked him. She thought he was kind. She was shocked, devastated when she learned what he really was. That's how good the mask was. Grandiose sense of self-worth. Bundy consistently believed he was smarter than everyone else, smarter than the police, smarter than prosecutors, smarter than his own attorneys. He insisted on representing himself at trial because he thought he could do better than trained lawyers. He couldn't, he was convicted. But even then, he seemed to believe his intelligence should have saved him. Pathological lying, Bundy lied about everything, all the time, even when there was no benefit to lying, even when the truth would have served him better. He lied to his girlfriends, his family, his lawyers, the police, journalists, psychiatrists. He lied in interviews days before his execution, even when he had nothing left to gain. The lying wasn't strategic, it was compulsive, as if truth and falsehood were interchangeable options and he simply chose whichever was more convenient in the moment. And then, lack of remorse. This is the most important one. In his final interviews, Bundy discussed his crimes in detail. He described what he had done. He analyzed his own behavior, but he never showed genuine remorse. He could say the words. He acknowledged that what he did was wrong. But there was no emotional weight behind it. He talked about murdering women the way you might talk about a mistake you made at work. Regrettable, unfortunate, but not something that haunted him. One psychiatrist who interviewed Bundy noted that his heart rate didn't change when he described killing. His voice stayed steady, His body remained relaxed. He wasn't suppressing his emotions. He didn't have emotions to suppress. How did Bundy become what he was? We'll never know for certain. But we can look at the factors that researchers have identified. His early life was marked by deception. Bundy was born to an unmarried mother in 1946. This was deeply shameful at the time, so his grandparents raised him as their own son, and his mother pretended to be his older sister. Ted grew up believing a lie about his own identity. His parents weren't his parents. His sister was actually his mother. He didn't learn the truth until he was an adult. Think about what this does to a developing mind. The most fundamental facts of your existence are false. The people who should be trustworthy are lying to you about who you are. This kind of early deception can interfere with the development of secure attachment. It teaches the child on a deep level that reality is negotiable, that people aren't who they claim to be, that trust is foolish. Then there was his grandfather. Samuel Cowell was, by all accounts, a violent and abusive man. He beat the family dog. He terrorized his wife. He had explosive rages that could be triggered without warning. Young Ted witnessed this violence. He absorbed it. He learned that power was what mattered, that the strong dominated the weak. Did these experiences create Bundy's psychopathy? Or did they simply shape how his pre-existing psychopathic traits express themselves? We can't know for certain. But the combination, possible genetic predisposition, disrupted attachment, exposure to violence, is exactly what the research predicts for the development of severe psychopathy. As a teenager and young adult, Bundy developed habits that, in retrospect, were warning signs. He prowled. Late at night, he would wander through neighborhoods, looking into windows, watching people who didn't know they were being watched. He wasn't doing anything illegal, not yet. He was just looking. But he was feeding something, some hunger that he didn't fully understand. He also consumed violent pornography, images of women being hurt, controlled, degraded. Later, Bundy would claim that pornography was responsible for his crimes, that it had corrupted him, that without it, he wouldn't have become a killer. Most researchers reject this explanation. Millions of people view pornography without becoming violent. But for someone who already had psychopathic traits, someone who already saw others as objects, someone who already lacked empathy, the pornography may have provided a template, a script, a way of organizing urges that were already present into something more specific. Bundy didn't become a psychopath because of pornography. He was already a psychopath. But pornography may have helped him figure out what his psychopathy wanted to do. And then there was Stephanie Brooks. Bundy met her in 1967. She was everything he wanted to be associated with. Wealthy, sophisticated, from a prominent family. He was obsessed with her, but eventually Stephanie grew tired of him. She saw him as aimless, immature, not going anywhere. She broke up with him. For most people, rejection hurts. But eventually, we move on. We heal. We find other relationships. Bundy didn't move on. The rejection wounded his narcissism. It was proof that he wasn't as special as he believed himself to be. And for a psychopathic narcissist, that kind of wound doesn't heal. It festers. It becomes rage. Years later, Bundy tracked Stephanie down. He had transformed himself, gone back to school, built a successful image. He presented himself as the man she had wished he was. Stephanie was impressed. They rekindled the relationship. They even discussed marriage. And then Bundy disappeared from her life. He stopped calling, stopped writing, cut her off completely. It was revenge. Calculated, patient revenge that had taken years to execute. But it wasn't enough, because around that same time, women started disappearing. Young women with long, dark hair parted in the middle. Women who looked like Stephanie. Bundy's method revealed his psychology. He used charm as a weapon. He would approach women in public places, shopping centers, college campuses, parks. He would wear a fake cast on his arm or use crutches. He would pretend to be injured, struggling to carry something. He would ask for help. And because he was handsome, because he seemed safe, because he looked like someone you could trust, they would help him. That was the trap. The cast was fake. The injury was fake. The charm was real but empty. And by the time they realized something was wrong, it was too late. Bundy was eventually caught. eventually convicted, eventually executed. On January 24, 1989, he died in Florida's electric chair. But his case changed how we understand predators. Before Bundy, people believed they could spot evil, that it would be obvious, that dangerous people would seem dangerous. Bundy proved that wasn't true. The mask of sanity can be perfect. The most dangerous person in the room might be the most charming one. And that's a lesson worth remembering, even late at night, even as you drift off to sleep. The world is full of people who are exactly what they appear to be, but some are not. And the difference isn't always visible. Let yourself relax for a moment. That was a lot of information, a lot of concepts, a lot to think about. You don't need to remember all of it. You don't need to hold on to every detail. Just let it wash over you. Let your mind absorb what it wants to absorb. The next section is about something different. It's about how the mind can hide things from itself, how someone can do terrible things in one context while functioning normally in another. It's about compartmentalization. And we're going to explore it through the case of John Wayne Gacy, but take your time. There's no rush. Let your breathing slow down. And when you're ready, we'll continue. Let's talk about something your mind does every day without you noticing. Compartmentalization. It's a psychological term, but the concept is simple. It's the ability to separate different parts of your life, to put things in different mental boxes, to be one person in one context and someone slightly different in another. You do this all the time. At work, you're professional, focused. You handle problems calmly. You interact with colleagues in a certain way. At home, you're different, more relaxed, maybe sillier. You let your guard down. And if something difficult is happening in your personal life, a health scare, a relationship problem, a family crisis, you can often set it aside during work hours. Put it in a box. Deal with it later. That's compartmentalization. And it's healthy. It's adaptive. It's how we function in a complex world with competing demands. But in some people, compartmentalization becomes something else, something extreme, something that allows them to do terrible things in one part of their life while maintaining complete normalcy in another. To be a monster in the basement and a pillar of the community upstairs, to bury bodies beneath your house while your wife cooks dinner in the kitchen above them. That's what we're exploring tonight. And the case that illustrates this most clearly is John Wayne Gacy. Before we get to Gacy himself, let's understand the psychology a little better. Compartmentalization is what psychologists call a defense mechanism. Defense mechanisms are mental strategies we use to protect ourselves from anxiety, from painful emotions, from truths we're not ready to face. Sigmund Freud first described them over a century ago. And while many of Freud's ideas have been revised or rejected, the concept of defense mechanisms has held up remarkably well. We all use them. Denial is a defense mechanism, refusing to accept something painful. Rationalization is a defense mechanism, coming up with logical explanations for behavior that's actually driven by emotion. Projection is a defense mechanism, attributing your own unacceptable feelings to someone else. And compartmentalization is a defense mechanism, separating conflicting thoughts, emotions, or aspects of yourself into different mental compartments so they don't have to interact. In moderate forms, this is healthy. A surgeon who loses a patient can't fall apart in the operating room. They need to compartmentalize, set aside the grief temporarily so they can continue functioning. They'll process it later. A parent going through a divorce can't break down every time they're with their children. They compartmentalize the pain so they can be present for their kids. This is adaptive compartmentalization. It helps us cope with difficult situations. But in extreme forms, compartmentalization becomes something darker. It allows people to maintain completely separate identities, to do things in one context that would be unthinkable in another, to hide aspects of themselves not just from others, but from their own conscious awareness. There's a related concept called dissociation. Dissociation is when parts of your experience become disconnected from each other. Your thoughts disconnect from your emotions. Your actions disconnect from your sense of self. Your memories disconnect from your current awareness. In mild forms, dissociation is common. Ever driven home and realized you don't remember the last 10 minutes of the drive? That's mild dissociation. Your conscious mind was elsewhere while your automatic processes handled the driving. In severe forms, dissociation can lead to what used to be called multiple personality disorder, now called dissociative identity disorder. This is when the compartmentalization is so extreme that different identities or alters develop, each with their own memories, behaviors, and sense of self. Most researchers believe DID is rare, and there's ongoing debate about how exactly it works. But the underlying mechanism and the ability of the mind to wall off different aspects of experience from each other is well established. And some criminals seem to use this mechanism in disturbing ways. They create a separation between their normal self and their criminal self. The two parts don't interact, don't communicate, don't contaminate each other. During the day, they can be loving parents, dedicated employees, active community members. At night, they can be something else entirely. And the two selves never have to meet. John Wayne Gacy is perhaps the most extreme example of this we've ever seen. He was a businessman, a Democrat, a JC, a volunteer, a host of elaborate parties, a man who dressed as a clown to entertain children at hospitals. He was also a serial killer who murdered at least 33 young men and buried 29 of them in the crawl space beneath his house. His wife lived in that house. His stepchildren lived in that house. Neighbors visited that house for parties and barbecues, and nobody suspected anything. How is that possible? Let's start at the beginning. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942 in Chicago. His father was a man named John Stanley Gacy, a World War I veteran, a machinist, an alcoholic, and a brutal, domineering presence in the home. John Stanley was never satisfied with his son. Nothing the boy did was ever good enough. If young John brought home good grades, his father found something to criticize. If he tried to help around the house, he did it wrong. His father called him stupid, sissy, worthless. He beat him with a leather belt, sometimes for specific infractions, sometimes for nothing at all. The abuse was constant, relentless, unpredictable. Young John never knew when the next blow would come, never knew what would trigger his father's rage. He lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, trying to anticipate, trying to avoid, trying to be good enough. He never was. His mother was kind but powerless. She couldn't protect her children from her husband's violence. She could only watch, helpless, as her son was torn down again and again. This kind of childhood has profound effects on psychological development. When a child grows up with an abusive parent, they face an impossible situation. They depend on their parent for survival. They need to love them. They need to feel loved by them. But their parent is also a source of pain, of fear, of unpredictable violence. How does a child's mind handle this contradiction? Often through compartmentalization. The child learns to separate the good parent from the bad parent, to love one and fear the other, to experience them as almost different people, even though they're the same person. This is adaptive. It protects the child's attachment bond. It allows them to continue functioning in an impossible situation. But it also teaches the child a dangerous lesson. It teaches them that people can be two different things at once, that someone can be loving at dinner and violent an hour later. That identity is fluid, contextual, changeable, that you can be one person in one moment and someone entirely different in the next. There's another dynamic that sometimes develops in abusive households. It's called identification with the aggressor. This concept was first described by Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, who became an important psychologist in her own right. Here's how it works. When a child is being abused, they feel helpless, powerless, terrified. These feelings are overwhelming. The child can't tolerate them, so the mind finds a way to escape them. Instead of identifying with the victim, which would mean feeling helpless, the child identifies with the aggressor. They mentally align themselves with the powerful one, the one in control. This provides psychological relief. Instead of feeling weak, they feel strong. Instead of feeling afraid, they feel powerful. But it comes at a cost. The child internalizes the aggressor's behavior. They learn that power and dominance are the solution to feeling vulnerable. They may grow up to become aggressive themselves, not despite the abuse they suffered, but because of it. They become what was done to them. Gacy showed signs of this dynamic throughout his life. He desperately wanted his father's approval. He worked hard. He tried to succeed. He joined organizations. He volunteered. He built businesses. Everything was an attempt to prove his worth, to finally hear his father say he was good enough. But his father died while Gacy was in prison for his first offense, a sodomy conviction in 1968. He never got to prove himself, never got the approval he craved. That wound never healed, and perhaps the young men he killed represented something. Perhaps they were stand-ins for the weak, vulnerable part of himself that his father had despised. Perhaps by destroying them, he was destroying the part of himself he had been taught to hate. We can't know for certain. The mind is complex, and Gacy's mind was more complex than most. But the patterns are there, the abuse, the desperate need for approval, the identification with power, the compartmentalization that allowed him to be two people at once. Let's talk about Gacy's adult life, because this is where the compartmentalization becomes truly remarkable. In his 20s, Gacy seemed to be building exactly the life his father would have wanted for him. He got married, he had a job managing Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants, he joined the JCs, a civic organization for young men, and threw himself into community service. He was good at it, really good. He organized events, he raised money, he networked, he climbed the ranks of the organization, he was named outstanding vice president of his local chapter. He was a success. And during the same period, he was sexually assaulting teenage boys who worked at his restaurants. How did he hold both of these realities in his mind? Compartmentalization. The successful businessman Gacy existed in one mental compartment. The sexual predator Gacy existed in another. The two didn't interact. During the day, at work, at JC's meetings, Gacy could genuinely believe he was a good person, a community leader, a man on his way up. At night, in private, another self emerged, one with different urges, different behaviors, different moral rules. And when the night was over, that self went back in its box. The successful businessman returned. No guilt bled through, no conflict between the two selves. They were kept separate, clean, distinct. In 1968, it caught up with him. One of his victims reported the abuse. Police investigated. More victims came forward. Gacy was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years in prison for sodomy. His wife divorced him. His JC's career was over. Everything he had built collapsed. But here's the remarkable thing. In prison, Gacy was a model inmate. He worked hard, he followed the rules. He impressed the parole board with his rehabilitation. He was released after just 18 months, and he started over. Gacy moved back to Chicago. He got a job. He stayed out of trouble. He began building again. Within a few years, he had started his own construction company, PDM Contractors. They specialized in remodeling pharmacies. He was successful. He bought a house in Norwood Park, a quiet suburb. He remarried. His second wife, Carol, had 2 daughters from a previous marriage. Gacy became their stepfather. He rejoined the community. He threw elaborate parties at his house. He became known for his hospitality. And he developed his clown personas, Pogo the Clown, Patches the Clown. He designed the costumes himself. He would dress up and perform at children's hospitals, at birthday parties, at charitable events. He was photographed with First Lady Rosalind Carter. The transformation was complete. John Wayne Gacy was a pillar of the community. And he had already started killing. His first confirmed murder was in January 1972. A teenager named Timothy McCoy, Gacy, picked him up at a bus station, offered him a place to stay for the night. What happened next? Gacy would later describe it in clinical, detached terms. He claimed McCoy came at him with a knife, that he killed him in self-defense, that he was shocked when he realized the boy was dead. None of this matches the evidence. Gacy buried McCoy in his crawl space, and something shifted in his mind. He would later say that after killing McCoy, he realized something about himself, something that had perhaps always been there, waiting. He enjoyed it. The power, the control, the absolute dominance over another person, it was intoxicating. And he wanted more. Over the next 6 years, Gacy killed at least 32 more young men. His victims were typically between 14 and 21 years old. Many were employees of his construction company. Others were runaways, drifters, young men looking for work. Vulnerable people, people who wouldn't be immediately missed. Gacy had a method. He would lure victims to his house with the promise of a job, or money, or just a place to hang out. He would offer them alcohol, marijuana. He would wait until they were relaxed. Then he would show them what he called the rope trick, a magic trick with handcuffs. He would demonstrate how they worked, how you could escape from them if you knew the secret. He would encourage the young man to try on the handcuffs. Once the handcuffs were on, there was no escape, no trick, just Gacy. The killings occurred in a specific part of the house, at specific times, under specific circumstances. This is compartmentalization in action. Gacy didn't feel like a killer when he was at work or at parties or performing as a clown. Those were different contexts, different selves. The killer self only emerged in certain conditions, in certain spaces, at certain times. The rest of the time, that self was locked away. And the normal Gacy genuinely experienced himself as normal. His wife lived in that house. Let that sink in for a moment. Carol Gacy cooked meals in that kitchen, slept in that bedroom, watched television in that living room. Beneath her feet, in the crawl space, bodies were decomposing. She noticed a smell sometimes, a strange, persistent odor. Gacy told her it was moisture, a drainage problem, nothing to worry about. She believed him. Why wouldn't she? He was her husband. He was a successful businessman. He was active in the community. He couldn't possibly be. The mind doesn't go there, not without reason, not without evidence. And Gacy gave her no evidence, because in her presence, in their daily life together, he wasn't a killer. That was a different John. This level of compartmentalization is almost impossible to comprehend. Most people cannot imagine doing terrible things in one part of their life while maintaining normalcy in another. Our guilt would leak through, our anxiety would show, our sleep would be disturbed, our behavior would change. But Gacy showed none of this. His wife noticed nothing, his employees noticed nothing, his neighbors noticed nothing. How? Part of the answer is the psychopathic traits he also possessed. Gacy wasn't just compartmentalized, he also had the emotional deficits we discussed earlier. Lack of remorse, lack of empathy, the ability to see other people as objects rather than human beings. If you don't feel guilt, there's nothing to leak through. If you don't feel empathy for your victims, their suffering doesn't haunt you. The compartmentalization keeps the behavior separate. The psychopathy keeps the emotions manageable. Together, they create something terrifying. A person who can do unspeakable things and then go upstairs and eat dinner with their family, without trembling, without crying, without any visible sign that anything is wrong. But there's another factor worth considering: Gacy's sexuality. He grew up in a time and place where homosexuality was deeply stigmatized. His father had called him a sissy, had beaten him for any sign of weakness or femininity. Gacy desperately wanted to be normal, to be what his father wanted, to be a successful man with a wife and family. But he was attracted to men. This created an impossible internal conflict, and compartmentalization was his solution. The normal Gacy was heterosexual, married, a family man. The other Gacy, the one who emerged at night, who picked up young men, who did terrible things to them, that was something else, something separate, something that didn't count as really him. By keeping these selves apart, Gacy could maintain his image of himself as normal. The homosexual acts didn't threaten his identity because they happened in a different compartment. They were committed by a different self. This doesn't excuse anything. It doesn't reduce his responsibility. But it helps explain the psychological mechanism. Compartmentalization allowed Gacy to be a monster without seeing himself as one. The end came in December 1978. A 15-year-old named Robert Piest disappeared. He had told his mother he was going to talk to a contractor about a job, a contractor who had been doing work at the pharmacy where Robert worked. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Robert's mother was not the kind of person to let things go. She pushed the police. She demanded they investigate. She wouldn't accept that her son had simply run away. The police brought Gacy in for questioning. He was calm, cooperative, charming. He admitted he had spoken to Robert, but said the boy never came to his house. He seemed concerned, helpful. But detectives felt something was off. They dug into his background. They found the 1968 sodomy conviction. They got a search warrant. On December 22, 1978, police entered Gacy's crawlspace. The smell hit them immediately. Decomposition, death, the unmistakable odor of bodies left too long in an enclosed space. They found 29 corpses buried in that crawl space, stacked on top of each other in shallow graves, decomposed beyond recognition. 4 more bodies were eventually recovered from the Des Plaines River, where Gacy had dumped them when the crawl space ran out of room. 33 victims in total. Many were never identified. To this day, some remain unknown, boys whose families never learned what happened to them. Gacy's trial was a spectacle. His defense tried to argue insanity. They claimed he suffered from multiple personality disorder, that the killings were committed by an alternate personality, Bad Jack, that Gacy couldn't control. The jury didn't believe it. Gacy was too organized, too methodical. He had disposed of bodies carefully. He had lied to police convincingly. He had maintained his double life for years. This wasn't someone who couldn't control their behavior. This was someone who chose not to. Gacy was convicted of 33 murders. He was sentenced to death. On death row, Gacy continued to maintain his compartmentalized view of himself. He painted, he created artwork, including many clown paintings that sold to collectors. He gave interviews. He discussed his case with journalists and researchers. But he never fully admitted responsibility. He claimed that the employees must have committed the murders, that the bodies were planted, that he was being framed. Even faced with overwhelming evidence, he couldn't or wouldn't integrate the killer self with his conscious identity. The compartments remained separate to the end. John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. His last words were reportedly, "Kiss my ass, no remorse, no acceptance, no integration, just defiance." And perhaps, in some twisted way, a final assertion of the normal Gacy over the monster he refused to acknowledge. What does Gacy's case teach us about compartmentalization? Several things. First, the human mind is capable of extraordinary self-deception. We like to think we know ourselves, that we're unified beings with consistent identities. But the mind is more fragmented than we realize. Different contexts bring out different aspects of ourselves. Different mental compartments can contain different values, different behaviors, even different moral codes. Most of us keep these compartments relatively integrated. There's communication between them, consistency across them. But when that integration breaks down, due to trauma, due to psychopathy, due to extreme psychological pressure, the compartments can become isolated, and terrible things can happen in one compartment while the others remain unaware. Second, compartmentalization can make predators very hard to detect. If someone genuinely doesn't experience guilt, if their criminal self is locked away when they're in normal contexts, there may be no warning signs, no change in behavior, no suspicious affect, no evidence that anything is wrong. The mask isn't a performance they're consciously maintaining, it's simply who they are in that context. This is terrifying. But it's important to understand, because it means we can't always trust appearances. The nicest person in your neighborhood might have secrets. The most active volunteer might be hiding something. Not probably. This level of compartmentalization is rare. But possibly, let yourself rest for a moment. That was heavy material. You don't need to process it all right now, just let it settle. Our final section is about something different but related. It's about fantasy, about how violent thoughts begin, how they develop over time, and how, in some people, they eventually become reality. It's about the role of ritual and control in predatory behavior, and we're going to explore it through one more case. Dennis Rader, BTK, bind, torture, kill. A man who terrorized a city for decades, and who, in the end, was caught because he couldn't stop talking about what he'd done. But first, take a breath. There's no rush. We have time. Let's talk about something that happens inside the mind. Something private, something hidden, fantasy. Everyone has fantasies, daydreams, mental scenarios that play out in the privacy of your own head. Most fantasies are harmless, pleasant even. You imagine winning the lottery, getting a promotion, meeting someone attractive, taking a perfect vacation. These fantasies are a normal part of mental life. They help us process desires, plan for the future, escape from stress. But some people have different kinds of fantasies, darker ones. Fantasies about hurting people, controlling them, dominating them. And here's the question that researchers have wrestled with for decades. Why do some people have these fantasies and never act on them, while others eventually do? What's the difference? What happens in the mind that transforms a dark thought into a dark action? Tonight, we're going to explore that question, and we're going to do it through the case of Dennis Rader, BTK, a man who lived in his fantasy world for decades, who rehearsed violence in his mind thousands of times before committing it in reality. and who kept returning to that fantasy world long after the killing stopped. First, let's understand what we mean by violent fantasy from a clinical perspective. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5, includes a category called paraphilias. Paraphilias are intense, persistent sexual interests in things that are atypical, things outside the norm of what most people find arousing. Some paraphilias are relatively harmless, a foot fetish, for example, unusual but not hurting anyone. But some paraphilias involve suffering, humiliation, pain, non-consent, and the most dangerous of these is sexual sadism. Sexual sadism disorder, the clinical term, is characterized by recurrent, intense sexual arousal from the physical or psychological suffering of another person, not the pretend suffering of consensual role play, real suffering, genuine pain, actual terror. For someone with this disorder, another person's fear is arousing. Their pain is exciting. Their helplessness is the whole point. This is rare. Most estimates suggest that severe sexual sadism affects less than 1% of the population. But when it does occur, and when it's combined with other factors, psychopathy, opportunity, a certain kind of fantasy life, it can lead to predatory violence. Let's talk about how violent fantasies develop. Because they don't appear out of nowhere. They have a trajectory, a progression. Researchers who have studied violent offenders have identified a common pattern. It often begins in childhood or early adolescence. The individual experiences something, abuse, exposure to violence, a certain image or scenario, that becomes linked with arousal. This linkage may be accidental, random, a quirk of neural wiring at a critical developmental moment. But once established, it tends to persist. The individual begins to fantasize about the scenario. They replay it in their mind. They elaborate on it. They add details. Each time they return to the fantasy, it becomes more familiar, more comfortable, more arousing. And the brain responds. Neural pathways are strengthened through repetition. The more you think about something, the more automatic those thought patterns become. This is true for any skill or habit. It's how we learn to drive, to play an instrument, to speak a language. But it's also true for fantasies. The more someone rehearses a violent scenario in their mind, the more that scenario becomes part of their mental furniture. The more natural it feels, the less disturbing. Over time, the fantasy may start to feel inevitable, like something that will happen eventually, like something that should happen. There's a concept in psychology called the fantasy behavior progression. It describes how someone moves from purely mental fantasy to actual behavior. The progression typically has stages. First, there's pure fantasy. The scenarios exist only in the mind. They're private, secret, unacted upon. Second, there's what researchers call tryouts, small behaviors that approach the fantasy without fully enacting it. Prowling at night, watching potential victims from a distance, breaking into homes when no one is there. Collecting items, underwear, photographs, from potential targets. These tryouts serve a purpose. They bring the fantasy closer to reality. They test whether the individual can actually do these things. They build confidence. Third, there's escalation. The tryouts become more bold, more risky. The individual gets closer and closer to acting on the full fantasy. And finally, there's the actual offense. The fantasy becomes reality. But here's the crucial point. For most people with violent fantasies, the progression stops somewhere along the way. They fantasize but never do tryouts, or they do tryouts but never escalate, or they escalate but pull back at the last moment. Something stops them. Fear of consequences, a moment of empathy, a competing attachment to their normal life. The ones who go all the way, who complete the progression, are rare. But when they do, they've often been rehearsing for years, sometimes decades. Dennis Rader is perhaps the clearest example of this progression we've ever seen. He documented it himself, in journals, in drawings, in autobiographical writings he created over the years. He left behind a detailed record of his inner fantasy life. And what that record shows is a man who lived in violent fantasy for almost his entire existence. Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas. His childhood was, by all external appearances, normal. Middle-class family, 4 sons. Father was a former Marine who worked for the gas company. Mother was a bookkeeper. They were Lutheran, church-going, respectable. Nothing about the family seemed unusual, but inside young Dennis's mind, something was developing. He would later admit that he began having violent fantasies at a very young age. Before puberty, he would imagine tying up women, controlling them, hurting them. These weren't passing thoughts. They were persistent, recurring, consuming. He would act them out with dolls, binding them with string, imagining scenarios. He began collecting images of bound women from detective magazines. He would study them, memorize them, use them to fuel his fantasies. And he began killing animals, hanging cats, dogs, watching them die. He described feeling a thrill, a sexual excitement, a sense of power and control. These are warning signs, what psychologists call the homicidal triad when combined with fire setting and bedwetting. Not everyone with these signs becomes violent, but they indicate something abnormal in development, something worth paying attention to. No one paid attention. As Rader grew older, the fantasies didn't fade, they intensified. He developed what he called projects. These were specific women he had identified as potential targets. He would watch them, learn their routines, imagine what he would do to them. He created detailed mental scenarios. He drew pictures. He wrote stories about what he would do when the time came. This is the fantasy life becoming organized, structured, specific, not vague thoughts of violence, concrete plans focused on real people. But he didn't act, not yet. He graduated high school, he joined the Air Force. He was stationed at various bases around the world. During this time, he continued to prowl, to watch women, to fantasize. But something held him back. Fear of consequences, perhaps, or simply the lack of opportunity. The fantasy was building pressure, though, year after year, decade after decade, waiting for release. Rader returned to Kansas after his military service. He enrolled at Wichita State University. He studied administration of justice. Yes, the study of criminal justice and law enforcement. The future serial killer was studying how criminals get caught. He earned his degree, he got married. He and his wife Paula had 2 children, he got a job, worked various positions over the years, eventually became a compliance officer for Park City, enforcing zoning regulations and animal control laws. He was active in his church, Christ Lutheran Church. He served on the church council. He was elected president. He was a Cub Scout leader. From the outside, Dennis Rader was the most ordinary man imaginable. Boring even, a stickler for rules, a bureaucrat, the kind of neighbor you'd nod at but never really notice. And the whole time, inside his head, the fantasies continued. On January 15th, 1974, the fantasy became reality. Rader had been stalking the Otero family for weeks. He had watched them, learned their routines, planned his approach. That morning, he cut the phone line to their house and entered through the back door. Inside, he found Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, and 2 of their children, 9-year-old Joseph Jr. and 11-year-old Josephine. What happened next took hours. Rader bound all 4 family members. He strangled Joseph and Joseph Jr. He suffocated Julie with a plastic bag, and then he took 11-year-old Josephine to the basement. What he did to her, I won't describe in detail, but it matched his fantasies exactly. The binding, the control, the terror. He had been rehearsing this in his mind for 20 years. And now it was real. Afterward, Rader took souvenirs from the house. Personal items, objects that would help him remember, that would let him relive the experience in his mind. This is a key feature of sadistic offenders. The actual crime is only part of the experience. The fantasy continues. Afterward, they return to the event mentally. They replay it. They use souvenirs, drawings, writings to enhance the memories. The crime is not an endpoint. It's a new chapter in an ongoing fantasy life. Rader would later describe how he would revisit the Otero killings in his mind, how he would draw pictures of what he had done, how he would write about it. The fantasy didn't stop when the killing stopped. It continued, fed by memories, kept alive by artifacts. Over the next few years, Rader killed again and again. Catherine Bright in 1974, Shirley Vian in 1977, Nancy Fox in 1977. Each time the pattern was similar: stalking, watching, planning, then striking, binding, torturing, killing. And afterward, the souvenirs, the memories, the continued fantasy life. But something else was developing too, a need for recognition. In October 1974, after the Otero murders, Rader did something unusual. He contacted the media. He called a local newspaper and directed them to a letter he had hidden in a book at the public library. The letter described the Otero killings in detail that only the killer could know, and it included a name he had chosen for himself. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK. BTK. He was branding himself, creating an identity separate from Dennis Rader, a public persona for the killer. This wasn't about evading detection. If anything, contacting the media increased his risk. It was about something else. Recognition, fame, legacy. He wanted the world to know what he had done. He wanted to be remembered. This need for recognition is common among certain types of offenders. It's rooted in narcissism. Narcissistic individuals have an inflated sense of their own importance. They believe they're special, unique, destined for greatness. For most narcissists, this manifests in ordinary ways: bragging, self-promotion, seeking admiration in their careers or social lives. But for a narcissist who is also a violent offender, the crimes themselves become a source of narcissistic supply. They're proud of what they've done. They want others to appreciate their work. They feel frustrated when they don't receive the recognition they believe they deserve. This is why serial killers sometimes contact police or media, why they leave signatures at crime scenes, why they can't just commit their crimes and disappear. The narcissistic need for attention competes with the survival need to stay hidden. And sometimes the narcissism wins. After 1977, Rader entered what he called a cooling-off period. He didn't kill for 8 years. The fantasies continued, the prowling continued, the projects continued, but he didn't complete the progression. Why? Rader later claimed he believed police were closing in on him, that he needed to be careful. In reality, police had no idea who he was. The investigation had gone cold, but something held him back. Perhaps the risks had become too high. He had a family now, a career, a position in the community. Perhaps the fantasy was enough. For a while, he would later describe how he would bind himself during this period, take photographs of himself in bondage positions, create elaborate scenarios with himself as both perpetrator and victim. The fantasy life continued even when the killing paused. In 1985, he killed again. Maureen Hedge, a neighbor, then Vicki Wegerle in 1986, then Dolores Davis in 1991, each time the same pattern: stalking, planning, fantasy, then reality, then more fantasy fueled by the new memories. After 1991, he stopped killing entirely, but he didn't stop fantasizing. He didn't stop drawing pictures. He didn't stop writing about what he had done. The fantasy world was always there, waiting. For 13 years, BTK was silent. No killings, no communications. The case went cold. Many people assumed the killer had died or been imprisoned for something else, or simply moved away. Wichita began to forget. Dennis Rader continued living his ordinary life, going to church, working his compliance job, playing with his grandchildren, and inside his head, reliving his crimes. But as the years passed, something began to bother him. No one was talking about BTK anymore. The newspapers had moved on, the public had forgotten. He was being erased from history. For a narcissist, this is intolerable. In March 2004, Rader saw a newspaper article about the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders. The article suggested that BTK might be dead. This infuriated him. He wasn't dead. He was right there. He had done all these things and no one was giving him credit anymore. So he made a decision. He would remind them. Over the next 11 months, Rader sent 11 communications to media and police. Letters, puzzles, word games, a doll bound with pantyhose, a victim's driver's license that had been missing for decades, detailed descriptions of his crimes. He was reopening his case, demanding attention, insisting on recognition. Each communication was a risk. Each one could have led to his capture. But the need for recognition was stronger than the need for self-preservation. He couldn't bear being forgotten. One of his communications included a question. He asked police directly, if he sent them a floppy disk, could it be traced back to him? Police responded through a coded message in a newspaper. They said no. A floppy disk would be safe. They were lying. Rader believed them. On February 16, 2005, a floppy disk arrived at a television station. It contained documents, puzzles, writings. It also contained metadata, deleted files that had left traces on the disk. One of those traces identified the computer where the documents had been created: Christ Lutheran Church. The username was Dennis. Police obtained DNA from Rader's daughter from a medical test she had taken years earlier. They compared it to evidence from the BTK crimes. It was a familial match. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested near his home. He was 60 years old. He had been killing and fantasizing for over 3 decades. And he was caught because he trusted the police. Because his need for recognition overcame his caution. Because in the end, being remembered was more important than staying free. Dennis Rader pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. Kansas did not have the death penalty at the time of his crimes. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, a minimum of 175 years. He will die in prison. At his sentencing hearing, Rader spoke at length about his crimes. He described them in detail. Clinically, almost proudly, he used his own terminology. Trolling for victims. Projects. The fantasy. He showed no genuine remorse. He seemed almost pleased to finally have an audience, to finally explain his life's work. The families of his victims sat the courtroom listening. Some wept, some left. Rader continued speaking, apparently oblivious to their pain. What does Dennis Rader's case teach us about violent fantasy? Several things. First, fantasy can precede action by decades. Rader fantasized about violent scenarios for more than 20 years before his first murder. The fantasy didn't cause the violence directly, but it prepared the ground. It normalized the ideas. It made the eventual action feel possible. Second, fantasy doesn't stop after the crimes. Rader continued living in his fantasy world between killings and after he stopped killing entirely. The souvenirs, the drawings, the writings. The fantasy was a parallel life that existed alongside his ordinary existence. Third, the need for recognition can be a vulnerability. Rader was careful for decades. He evaded detection. He lived a double life successfully. But his narcissism, his need to be known, to be remembered, to be appreciated for what he had done, ultimately brought him down. He couldn't stay silent. He had to contact the media. He had to communicate with police. And eventually, that need for recognition led directly to his capture. There's one more thing worth discussing about Rader, the question of why. Why did he develop these fantasies? Why did he act on them? What made him different from the millions of people who never harm anyone? We don't have complete answers. Rader himself has offered explanations. He's called his urges a demon inside him. He's described it as a compulsion he couldn't control. But these explanations feel incomplete. Many people have dark thoughts. Many people experience urges they find disturbing. What made Rader act on his? The research suggests it's a combination of factors: early development of deviant sexual interests, the pairing of violence with arousal at a formative age, years of fantasy rehearsal, strengthening the neural pathways, normalizing the scenarios, psychopathic traits, the lack of empathy, the ability to see others as objects, narcissism, the belief that his desires mattered more than other people's lives, opportunity, access to victims, time alone, the means to act, and perhaps some factor we don't understand yet, some quirk of neurology or psychology that tips certain individuals from fantasy into action. The truth is, we don't fully understand why some people become predators. We have pieces of the puzzle, but the complete picture remains elusive. Dennis Rader is still alive. He sits in a Kansas prison serving his 10 life sentences. He's reportedly cooperative, polite, he follows the rules. In prison, he's just another inmate. But inside his head, who knows what fantasies still play out there, what scenarios still run on repeat, what memories he still revisits in the quiet hours. The fantasy world never really dies, it just waits. Let yourself rest now. That was heavy material. 3 cases, 3 patterns, 3 windows into how certain minds work. Psychopathy, compartmentalization, violent fantasy, and sadism. You don't need to remember everything. You don't need to hold on to every detail. Just let it settle. Let your mind process what it needs to process, and let the rest drift away. We've come to the end of our journey tonight. 3 men, 3 psychological concepts, 3 attempts to understand something that, in some ways, remains beyond understanding. Ted Bundy showed us the mask of sanity, the ability to appear not just normal, but exceptional while hiding something monstrous underneath. He demonstrated that psychopathy isn't about being obviously disturbed. It's about what's missing inside, the empathy, the remorse, the genuine human connection. John Wayne Gacy showed us compartmentalization at its most extreme, the ability to maintain separate identities, to be a killer in one context and a community leader in another, to bury bodies in your crawl space while your wife cooks dinner upstairs. Dennis Rader showed us the power of fantasy, how violent thoughts can develop over decades, how they can be rehearsed, refined, and eventually enacted, and how the need for recognition can ultimately overcome the need for self-preservation. These cases are disturbing. There's no way around that. But they're also instructive. They teach us that predators don't always look like predators, that the most dangerous person in a room might be the most charming, that the pillar of the community might be hiding something terrible, that the boring bureaucrat might have a rich inner life we can't imagine. They teach us that the human mind is capable of extraordinary things, both extraordinary good and extraordinary evil, and that the line between the two can sometimes be thinner than we'd like to believe. They teach us that psychology, for all its advances, still has limits. We can identify patterns, we can describe mechanisms, but we can't fully explain why some people become what they become. And maybe that uncertainty is important too. Maybe it should keep us humble, keep us curious, keep us paying attention. If you've stayed with me through all of this, thank you. This has been Late Night Psychology. There are more cases to explore, more patterns to examine, more questions to ask about why humans do what they do. But for now, it's time to rest. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Let your breathing slow down. Let the tension leave your body. You're safe, you're comfortable, you're exactly where you need to be. The world outside can wait until morning. For now, just rest. Sleep well.